Sophie Lane was not meant to audition that day. She had sat at the very back of the auditorium, arms folded tightly across her chest, a borrowed hoodie draped over her wiry frame like a makeshift shield. Her name wasn't on any list. She hadn't submitted a form, hadn't taken headshots, or selected sheet music. She was just there, watching and waiting, like she always did. The voices that echoed through the room were polished, rehearsed, and brimming with professional ambition. Girls with long legs and bright smiles, the kind of girls who had been singing since they were 6, who took voice lessons every Tuesday and had mothers who reminded them to project from the diaphragm. They sang with technical brilliance. Every note was perfect, every breath measured. But none of it made Sophie feel anything. She wasn't even sure why she stayed. Maybe because her mother said, "Sometimes you just have to sit in the room where you want to belong, even if no one invited you." Or maybe because something in her, small and defiant, whispered that she had a right to be there. She only realized the ache in her chest when the boy ahead of her began to sing, "Oh Sol Mio." His voice was trained, theatrical, probably destined for conservatories and spotlights. But she didn't feel it. She was listening to the notes, not the soul. And then, suddenly, there was a silence. One of the judges, a stern-looking woman with sharp cheekbones and a clipboard cradled like a weapon, turned toward the back of the room. "Is that everyone?" she asked. No one replied, and Sophie stood up.
She didn't know why.
Her legs moved before her mind caught up. Something had taken hold of her, not confidence, not exactly. Something more desperate, like a balloon ready to burst. Like a story that had waited 16 years to be told. I didn't sign up," she said. Her voice was thin, tremulous. The woman narrowed her eyes. "Do you have accompaniment?"
"No."
"Just me." The judges exchanged a glance. One of them chuckled. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either.
They didn't see her yet.
To them, she was another lost kid from somewhere with rough edges and no polish. Sophie walked to the center of the stage. Her sneakers squeaked on the hardwood. Her hands trembled. She closed her eyes.
And she sang.
"Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme." It was soft at first, broken in the corners. But something happened by the second line. The room, that cavernous, indifferent room, grew still. Sophie didn't sing like a girl trying to impress. She didn't belt. She didn't decorate the melody. She sang it like a lullaby she'd once heard in a dream. Fragile. Full of memory. Full of mourning. Her voice cracked slightly at, "She once was a true love of mine." But she didn't stop. She didn't apologize. Because that crack wasn't a mistake. It was pain.
It was beauty.
It was everything she had swallowed for years. All the slurs at school. The nights crying into a pillow while her mom worked late. The unspoken ache of being poor, unseen, forgotten. She didn't know music theory, but she knew longing. She didn't understand key changes, but she understood loss. When she opened her eyes, tears were rolling down her cheeks. But the judges didn't laugh. They didn't even blink. The woman with the clipboard slowly set it down. No one applauded. Not yet. Not because they weren't moved, but because they were stunned. The silence after Sophie's last note was the kind that only happens when something important has occurred, something sacred, like the space between a heartbeat and a breath. It wasn't about her voice. It wasn't even about the song. It was about the emotion she had bled into every syllable. The way she made something old feel like a wound freshly opened. The way she reminded them that music, at its core, wasn't performance, it was confession. One of the judges leaned forward. He looked like he'd forgotten he was holding a pen. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophie." Sophie Lane. She felt like collapsing. She wasn't used to being looked at like this, like she mattered. Her chest heaved. Her eyes were burning. "Where have you trained?" "I haven't," she said. "I just sing." The woman with the clipboard didn't speak for a long time. Then she said softly, "You made me feel something. I don't remember the last time someone did that." That night, Sophie walked home through the dark streets with her hands in her pockets, unsure if she had done something miraculous or foolish. But for the first time, she didn't feel like trash in a hoodie. She felt like a song. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Sophie Lane didn't win the audition. Not that day. They told her they'd be in touch, which was the kind of phrase people used when they didn't want to say no but couldn't quite say yes. But something changed in the way they looked at her. She saw it. The hesitation, the flicker of possibility, the way the woman with the clipboard no longer looked right through her. It wasn't a door wide open. It was a crack in the wall. And Sophie knew what to do with cracks. She'd been living in the spaces between them her whole life. For the next few weeks, she didn't wait for a call. She acted like no one was coming. She sang into a hairbrush in the bathroom, standing barefoot on cold tiles, listening to herself the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. She recorded herself on a phone with a shattered screen and played it back again and again, not to hear how good she sounded, but to catch where the truth dropped, where the emotion faded, where fear crept in and dulled her voice. Because fear was still there. It always was. She was afraid when she walked into the community center and asked for an old upright piano to practice on. She was afraid when she took the night shift at the diner to save enough for secondhand sheet music. She was afraid every time she looked into the mirror and saw not an artist, but a waitress who sang to ghosts in her free time.
But she did it anyway.
She practiced even when her voice cracked, even when her throat burned, even when she had no audience but the flickering light bulb above her bed. That was what no one saw about underdogs. The blood and the bruises didn't show up in highlight reels. The triumph began in the moments when no one was watching. Her first performance was in a half-lit rec hall with barely 20 chairs. She wore a black dress borrowed from a thrift store, slightly too big at the shoulders, pinned at the back with 2 safety pins. The pianist was an elderly woman with arthritis who forgot half the notes. Sophie sang anyway, and something happened. The room fell away. The nerves fell away. There was no spotlight, no drama. Just her, telling the truth. The song wasn't perfect, but it was honest. A man approached her after the show, heavy coat, tired eyes. "My wife died last year," he said quietly. "Your song made me feel like I got to say goodbye." She couldn't even speak. Just nodded, tears stinging. That's when Sophie realized something important. Winning wasn't always about beating someone. It wasn't about applause or fame or even recognition.
It was about matching.
And slowly she did. She started getting small gigs. A wedding here, a church service there, a street fair where no one listened until they did. People began to ask for her. Not because she hit the highest notes, but because she meant every note. She got invited back to the auditorium, this time officially. She auditioned again. Her name was printed on the program. No longer an outsider. Still not a favorite, but present. And then came the night. The hall was full. She was scheduled third, right after a boy with perfect pitch and a girl with a 5-octave range. She almost didn't go on. She was still that girl in the hoodie somewhere inside. Still the kid who thought if she walked on stage, someone might laugh. But when her name was called, she stepped forward. This time, her hands didn't shake. She didn't sing something flashy. No high belts. No vocal acrobatics. Just an old gospel ballad her mother used to hum while washing dishes. Wayfaring stranger. The first line came like a whisper, like a prayer. I am a poor wayfaring stranger. Every eye locked onto her. Every breath seemed to pause. She poured years into that song. Years of aching loneliness. Years of being overlooked, of being the last picked, the first dismissed. She sang not from confidence, but from scars. From truth. And when the last note faded, there was no sound for a long, trembling second. Then the applause came, real, thunderous, undeniable. She didn't win the trophy that night. But one of the judges found her backstage and said, "I've seen a lot of singers.
But you?
You move people. You don't need permission. You're already doing it." Sophie walked home that night without checking her phone for missed calls or casting lists. She didn't care if her name was on a certificate. She had triumphed in the only way that ever mattered. She had sung as herself. And the world had listened. Not because she was perfect. Because she was real. Sophie didn't tell her father about the performance right away. It wasn't that she didn't want to, it was that part of her still believed she didn't deserve his pride. Pride was something you earned when you brought home good grades, or a paycheck, or at least a plan. Sophie, in her mind, had never brought home anything but worry. So she let the days pass. She folded her dress carefully back into its thrift store bag and returned to her shift at the diner like nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. There was something new in her step, not quite confidence, but something more solid than hope. Resolve. Her father noticed. Of course he did. He was not a man who spoke often or loudly. He worked long hours at a repair garage on the edge of town, came home tired, and rarely asked for more than silence and a warm plate. But he had eyes like a hawk's, quiet, watchful. He saw through the masks she wore even when she thought she'd perfected them. Something happen? He asked one night, looking up from his plate as they sat across their tiny kitchen table. Sophie hesitated. Just sang somewhere. He nodded, chewing slowly. You've been singing since you were a baby. Not like this. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. But the next night, he came home with something in his hands, a dusty box, heavy, taped around the edges. He placed it on the table with a quiet grunt. Your mother's, he said simply. Sophie opened it and found her mother's old vinyl records, gospel, soul, some folk. Inside was also a faded lyric notebook, the kind with fraying corners and handwritten scribbles in blue ink. Her mother's voice returned to her, not through memory but through lines and verses, corrections and thoughts. It was like meeting her again, after years of silence. I kept it, he said after a pause, not looking at her. Didn't know if you'd ever want it. She was proud of you. I know she didn't say it much, but she was. Sophie blinked hard. She hadn't heard him talk about her mother in over a year. She never came to my recitals, she whispered.
She was scared, he replied.
Scared you'd hear her cry. Your voice that hurt her sometimes. In the good way. The way truth does. That night, Sophie read every note her mother had written. There were comments about timing, yes, and breath control, but also lines like, sing like you're the only one who knows the storm. Don't perform. Bleed. The truth matters more than the pitch. Sophie realized her mother had always understood what she was trying to become, even when she couldn't say it out loud. Her father, too, began to change in quiet ways. He started leaving the living room light on when she practiced late. He bought her throat lozenges when she came down with a cough. And once, when she came home after a long gig, her feet blistered, her heart a little bruised, she found a new mic stand waiting on her bed. Still in the box. No note. Just there. She found herself talking more, not about everything, but about the parts that mattered. About the places she sang, the songs she was learning, the people who cried or smiled when they listened. Her father rarely replied with more than a grunt, but sometimes she saw the corners of his mouth twitch, the soft flicker of something proud in his eyes. Then came the night he truly showed up. She had been invited to perform at a local benefit concert for the homeless. It wasn't glamorous. Folding chairs, a makeshift stage, a sound system that hummed with static. But the cause mattered. And she was the final act. She almost didn't see him in the crowd. He wasn't in the front. That wasn't his way. He stood in the back, arms crossed, wearing the same oil-stained jacket he always wore after work. But he was there. And when she opened her mouth to sing, a stripped-down version of Bridge Over Troubled Water, she felt something shift. For the first time, she wasn't trying to prove anything. Not to herself. Not to the world.
And not to him. She was just sharing.
Like her mother's notebook had said. Not performing. Bleeding. When it ended, the crowd rose. Not all at once. Slowly. Earnestly. Like they didn't want to disturb something sacred. Her father didn't clap loudly. But when she met him at the back door afterward, he said, You sounded like her. Sophie swallowed. I'm not her. No, he said, looking right at her for the first time that night. You're you. And that's more than enough. It was not a speech. It was not a tearful reunion. It was something better. A grounding. A truth. A root taking hold after years of drifting. From that night forward, Sophie didn't just sing with her voice. She sang from a place she hadn't dared touch in years. Home. And though the world would still push, and the stages would still test her, she had something now that she never had before. Not just resilience, but belonging. Someone in her corner. A voice in the crowd, silent but steadfast, that said, "You are not alone." For a while, it felt like everything was finally aligning. Sophie was singing more regularly, small gigs at cafes, open mics, even a local recording session in someone's basement studio that smelled of incense and old wires. She was earning just enough to justify the pursuit, but not enough to pretend it was stable. And yet, for someone who used to count quarters just to buy a single bus fare, it felt like progress. Still, reality didn't wait for applause. There was a moment, a Tuesday morning, overcast and unremarkable, when she stood in front of the mirror brushing her teeth and felt something crack. Not a breakdown, just a recognition. She stared at her own eyes and realized that even with all the passion, the rawness, the late nights and soul-stretching performances, she was still behind on rent. The dream had teeth, and it bit every month the bills came due. It wasn't that she wanted to quit, but she had to admit, finally and fully, that wanting something with your whole being didn't mean it would want you back with equal force. Dreams weren't fair. They weren't waiting for you like long-lost lovers. They were indifferent, mountains you either climbed or didn't. And most days, they didn't care if your boots had holes or if your heart was tired. That awareness didn't make her bitter. It made her sharper. She began to see the illusion in the glitter, how many overnight successes had been grinding in the shadows for a decade. How many doors stayed locked not because she lacked talent, but because she didn't know the right name to whisper. She started noticing the ones who rose fastest were often those who didn't just sing well but networked strategically, who understood self-promotion better than melody. She watched how the world cheered the polished more than the honest, and how honesty, while revered in speech, often got edited out in practice. But Sophie didn't let the truth poison her. She let it educate her. She took extra shifts at the diner, not out of defeat, but survival. She saved quietly, even while her peers dropped money on flashy new outfits and rented studio time they couldn't afford. She said no to gigs that didn't value her, not because she thought she was too good, but because she finally knew the difference between exposure and exploitation. She still sang always, but she started treating her art with the same precision others treated law, or medicine, or engineering. She studied vocal health. She mapped out her performances. She researched grants and local arts fellowships. She stopped waiting to be discovered and started discovering herself in the work, in the discipline, in the little victories nobody clapped for. Her father noticed the shift. One night he asked, "Still chasing it?" She sipped her tea, leaned against the counter. "I'm not chasing anymore." He looked up. "No. I'm walking it, 1 mile at a time." He nodded. That quiet, proud nod he reserved for when words might fail. And yet, despite the newfound realism, the fire never died. It just burned steadier.
Cleaner.
She began mentoring a girl named Cassie, a shy 16-year-old with a bruised voice and the kind of raw talent Sophie saw in herself years ago. Cassie reminded her that hope didn't have to be naive. It just had to be stubborn. They practiced after school in the back of the diner, near the ice machine. Cassie sang timidly at first, but over time, her voice grew stronger, freer. One day, she sang a note so pure it gave Sophie goosebumps. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Afterward, Cassie turned to her and said, "Do you think I could ever make it?" Sophie smiled, gently but without hesitation. "If you mean, will you ever be famous, I don't know. But if you mean, can you live a life where your voice matters, where it feeds you, not always with money but with meaning, then yes." "Yes, I do." Cassie nodded, unsure if she fully understood yet. But Sophie had learned. Truth took time to root. There would still be rejections. Auditions she wouldn't get. Nights she questioned everything. But she had built something sturdier than just desire. She had built endurance. She had accepted that dreams were not promises. They were invitations, and you had to show up for them. Even when the venue was half empty, the mic cracked, and no one knew your name. Realism hadn't killed her aspiration. It had carved it into something solid. Not a fantasy, a life.